It is okay to be wrong. It is not okay to be unreasonable. That if when you have an ethical conundrum, you need to make the best decision that you can based on everything available to you and due diligence. So you need to be reasonable, even if the end result you turn out to be wrong when more facts are known, right?
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by a panel of mental health colleagues to have a respectful conversation about a new technology that is showing up everywhere these days. I'm, of course, talking about AI. We'll get into the ways it can be used in private practice, the pros and cons of its use in various clinical ways, and how, once again, tech is preceding regulation, so we need to do our due diligence when we are considering using this. Welcome, everyone. We're going to take a minute and have each of you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your work in the field of mental health and anything else the listeners might want to know about you.
I'll go first. I'm Kim Tolson. I'm an LCSW, and I'm a therapist, but I'm also a coach to therapists. I help therapists learn about insurance billing in their private practice and also how to be a traveling therapist if they want to take the show on the road. But most recently, I've really gotten involved with AI, especially with my coaching business. And as I was using it, I figured out I can write my progress notes with it if I'm careful with PHI and how I do it. So that led me to write a course because everything I love, I feel obsessed with, I have to write a course about. So I wrote a course and I made it for therapists how to use it with their documentation and be safe with it with PHI.
Great. Liaf, do you want to go next?
My name is Liaf Dalton. I am the director of Person-Centered Tech, which is an organization that does continuing education, training, and provides material and resource support around legal, ethical, technological use within practices with a focus on HIPAA security compliance and risk management. This is a topic that has a lot of implications in terms of how to utilize this technology in a legal and ethical way, and what needs to be considered with regards to that. So I'm glad to be here today with all of you.
Great, thank you. All right, Jenny.
My name is Jenny Hughes, and I am a trauma psychologist, and I both practice clinically seeing adults who have experienced trauma and are dealing with things like PTSD, and I also work to support fellow trauma therapists in my membership, the Brave Trauma Therapists Collective. And the way that I have been exploring AI recently is in helping me to be able to better manage all the things that go into diversified income streams and managing content and creating things, and really exploring the pros and cons and the ethical ways to use that in a non-clinical therapist-facing fashion.
Hi, my name is Tamara Howell, and I'm a UK qualified psychotherapist based in France. I also create courses and coaching. I help therapists build private practices online and online businesses. I'm also the host of TheraBundle. I would describe myself as a light AI user, like an experimental user. So I've tried a few things, and the places where I have used it in a way that I found helpful are things like emails, course creation, I even tried out AI headshots, images, which was hilarious.
Me too. It was
Yeah,
awful.
legal statements, course planning. And so I would say I'm in the early stages of experimentation, but I have big plans for it. So I'm really interested to be involved in the discussion today.
Yeah, it's great. Well, it's so good to have everyone here. As most of us who are in the therapist Facebook groups know, this is popping up like literally every 5 minutes in a group somewhere, asking questions, debates, the complexities of it, all of those types of things. And so I think it's a really important conversation for us to have. And I also just like to share that most of us that are in those groups are private practice owners, solo private practice clinicians. And so it's up to each of us to choose what works best for us and do our own due diligence and be able to justify, if someone investigates us, how we made our decisions and how we're using these things. And so part of what I wanted to do today was kind of explore the different ways it's being used. I started using it. Kim Tolson introduced me to it. And I was literally like awake all night one night thinking of prompts, because once you put a prompt in and it like spits out something in 3 seconds and it's so amazing, that I was like trying to sleep, and I just kept thinking like, I want to ask it this. I want to ask it this. So I also have not really been using it in my clinical work. I don't know. I actually haven't even considered that yet, because right now I'm using it with the membership program that I have for therapists to get clinical consultation. So I think we did a good job of talking about the way each of us is using it. Let me just throw this out there, because in doing some research for us to meet today, I found that there are lots of services already out there that are being marketed to therapists. Even a big hospital system, University of Kansas Health Systems, has just adopted an AI program. It was very interesting to me because I've been thinking sort of like small potatoes. And when I was looking into this, I realized there's actually companies where you can pay a fee. You do your virtual session on their platform, they record it, and then they spit out your progress note. And they say it's HIPAA and GDPR compliant. So it's out there way more than I was aware of. And anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think it's amazing. I mean, I think it's a time saver. I think especially if hospital systems can ensure that it's going to be HIPAA compliant and protected. I'd love to hear what Lai thinks about that, but it's just going to make the workflow go so much easier. And I feel like it allows you to have more client time, which is exciting to me. So you're not spending hours like doing notes and documentation and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's one platform in particular that's specifically for mental health practitioners that's available to solo practitioners as well. Like, it's not only available on an enterprise tier that does HIPAA business associate agreements, where the training model for the AI transcription as well is all based on therapist input. So it has that clinical context where it's a lot more robust than ChatGPT, for example, where the machine learning has a very different input in terms of the information that's fed to it. So I'm really excited about seeing those services that are designed to address the security considerations, but also are less likely to have the ethical implications, negative ethical implications, because of bias that can occur when it comes to machine learning and what the input content is.
It's so interesting because as you're talking about it, I'm thinking, wow, that could really like improve the accuracy of notes. It could, there's so many times I've seen like a clinic letter written about, and there's so many mistakes, or, a doctor has like heard something I didn't say or heard it wrong, or, maybe copy pasted or whatever. And it could change so many things. But I also had this experience of meeting with my accountant and them having the AI note taker in the meeting with us, and it felt like someone was in the room with us. And I know that especially with AI where you're giving prompts like ChatGPT, it can start to feel for some people a bit like you're talking to someone. You're kind of making, I know that sounds like a bit weird, but it can kind of feel like you're having a conversation. I think that's a really interesting aspect, and I'm really interested in how that's going to affect, for example, if we use a platform that does our notes, things like that, how does that affect the content of the therapy, the relationship with the client?
Yes, go ahead.
I also think, and while I'm really excited about AI, I think that it's important to acknowledge that it can be a good starting point, but that especially in a clinical context, we have to be reviewing this stuff. So as a psychologist, I'm
Sure.
trained to do psychological assessments, and we've had computer scoring for years and years and years. We don't just put the computer scoring printout into an evaluation report because we have to interpret it. We have to use our knowledge and our humanness to interpret that and then communicate it. And so even as I'm using it in Brave, for example, which is a non-clinical place, it helps me with that like blank page syndrome to get things started. I've heard someone say, and this is a quote from someone else, it'll get you to a solid C, but it's your job to take it to like a B or an A, right? And so we have to still have our humanness there.
Yes.
And especially clinically, like there are things that we intentionally do not put in the record because it could be harmful to the client.
Right.
And so we have to have that balance. We can't just have one or the other, I think is one thing that comes up for me.
Right. Yeah. And as far as,
go ahead.
well,
Go
as
ahead,
far as
Jenny.
applications go, I think there's a huge gamut of how we can be using this. So in a private practice, we can use it for marketing to get the right text copy for our ideal client, to learn more about the population we're working with, to help us write social media postings or blog posts or things like that. Clinically, when I first started hearing about this, what came to mind with me was Wiley treatment planners and progress note planners, that you have this template that's the starting point that you pull those pieces from. And I was like, well, that would be a good use of this with, not putting a specific client's information in there, but, write a treatment plan for a middle-aged female who has anxiety related to X, Y, and Z. And then, like Jenny was saying, then we have that to build off of and to sort of get the wheels turning. Because one of the things that I see with therapists all the time is that we are so exhausted, especially since the pandemic, that writing the notes has become a huge problem for therapists. And people are getting behind, and that's never a good thing. And then when you're tired, it's hard to even think of what do I even put in a note? I feel like I've never even written a note. I'm so tired. I can't even call those things to mind. So to have that jumping off point would be a helpful thing. But then all the way to the far end where you're actually having it listen in on the sessions, create the progress note, even do some progress trackers, those types of things. And you have to have informed consent for your clients so they know that this AI bot or whatever it is listening to their session. And that's a huge implication for the therapeutic relationship, as we all know. And so those are all, it's a wide range of issues to be looking at here and ways we can use it.
Absolutely. I want to mention that one of the things that has come to my attention with regards to use of ChatGPT, in particular for progress notes, is that folks are trying to balance the HIPAA considerations and not put any identifiers into the prompt so that it does not, they aren't giving PHI to a third-party service provider that they can't get a business associate relationship with. The result, though, then, is that what is fed into the prompt is a lot more limited than what actually occurred in the session. And so the examples, I've seen a number of examples of here's the prompt I gave, and here's the SOAP note, for example, that it spit out, where it is filled in a lot of content, including symptoms, client's affect, visible emotional distress and upset, what the prompts were for how to respond to the situation that the therapist provided. Of course, that's something that then has implications, because if that isn't what actually transpired, that should not be going into the client's medical record. And one of the concerns that I have there is that in this context of burnout, right, that is so real, that it can be compelling to look at a note that looks excellent and you're like, oh, this really establishes medical necessity. If it got audited, the insurance company would be delighted. This is better than what I could write with my current capacity, so I'm going to utilize it. So that's where the responsibility of providers to, Jenny, as you said, bring that human element in is so important. But I would also go further and say, from my perspective, I think if we're talking about use application for progress notes in particular, and in clinical contexts, that this is why tools that are designed specifically for this use application, where you have a HIPAA business associate agreement, where you aren't trying to limit the information that it has access to, is going to be much better all around, legally, ethically, clinically.
Correct. Yes. I would imagine the listeners who are in private practice will already know what a business associate agreement is, but that's something that in private practice we have to have with any organization which we're sharing information with. That's a real simplified way of saying it. And basically they're affirming that they understand HIPAA and they're going to, do the things on their end that they need to do. And it's a protection, but it's also a requirement. And a lot of therapists who go into private practice don't necessarily know that. So that's an important piece to think about. And then also there are times where we're looking at something and a BAA is not the thing that comes first to our mind. I was looking for a fax service, and then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I have to make sure that I can get a BAA. It's that thing that's always there, but it's a good protection. But yes, we need to do our due diligence that we are making sure what is there is accurate and appropriate. And my experience with ChatGPT is that depending on what prompt you put in or the complexity of the prompt, like write this from the voice of, or write this from the perspective of, you can get vastly different outputs. And so, yes, I think I agree with Life that having a platform, if you're going to use it for that, is one that understands mental health, behavioral health, all those things, and can interpret things in a different way. But even then, I can't imagine seeing this. They call it a magic note in one of the platforms. It listens, and then 30 seconds later, you get a magic note. And I was like, that sounds very tempting. Like Live said, to be able to be like, wow, my magic note looks great. I'm just going to sign it and move on. But we need to make sure that we're not allowing the excitement of that to override good clinical judgment.
Yeah, I totally agree with Life, because I've created a whole course on this through ChatGPT, and literally, like you said, depending on the tone of voice and what you put in, it's going to fill in a soap note for you. It's going to fill in a whole treatment plan. It's going to fill in an assessment. I did a whole module on how to write assessments with it. And it does. It just assumes, like I did a little fake profile, a fictitious case, and it filled it in that he was single and his mother was an alcoholic. It filled in all this stuff. So I made a whole module in the course about that, professional responsibility. You have to go through this stuff. You have to take it over to your EHR, copy and paste it over there, and then edit it correctly. You can't just, like you said, be in burnout mode and be like, oh, this looks good, and just stick it over there and not think about it again, because I could see that happening. It's such a good point. Yeah.
I really love this professional responsibility aspect of this, because I'm in France and in the UK as well. We don't have BAAs. It's really GDPR police who are going to come and check out a therapist in private practice, as far as I know, really, unless someone gets reported to the ICO. But so it's really professional responsibility. It's a therapist wants to be ethical and compliant. And so I think there's so much responsibility here, but also so much opportunity, making some kind of checklist where we're okay, making sure that things that need to be left out are left out or written in a particular way, making sure that everything that's in there is accurate, whatever it is, whether it's marketing or whether it's to do with our clinical stuff. Also, whatever AI we're using, checking out I know no one loves this, but reading the privacy policy and understanding what happens with the information, because the information from my ChatGPT prompts may somehow appear in someone else's. Even if I tell ChatGPT, don't share the content of this with anyone else, we don't know, because it influences, and it keeps evolving and learning. And so, just privacy policies are where it's at.
Yeah, Kim and I actually did an experiment. We had it put some stuff together and then, will you keep this private and not share it with anyone else? And it was like, basically, no, this is crowdsourced information and we'll share it with anyone. So then I had it writing some copy specific to my program. And at the end, I said, this is specific to my program that I created. If somebody was asking for content related to this, is this information you'll share? And it said no, that it was writing, which was interesting. It was writing copy specific to my program, so it wouldn't automatically, and who knows if that's true or not. I'm skeptical because I'm sure they're going to take over the world any day now, but they seem to imply that no, that would be kept private.
Yeah, I asked the same thing. So I used it for a course outline. And at the end, I said, this is my course outline. Will you share this with anyone else? I want it for me. And it said, no, I will not share it with anyone else. But then I've seen someone else's conversation where they said, please don't use that kind of language about something. And then they said to ChatGPT, will you change how you use that language going forward? And ChatGPT said, yes. How you instruct me affects how I respond to everybody. So yes, there might be nuances on like, it's not going to share my 6 module titles, but it will affect what happens later. I love all that nuance and like all the differences and things like that. But I do think it is really interesting to learn about where it's stored, who owns it, where it shows up in the world.
Yeah. Kim, your course talks through some of the ethics. Are there some checklists? I haven't been through it thoroughly. It looks amazing. Yeah. Are there things to help someone guide, like, how do I want to use it? Not just, okay, or do you assume they're starting from the place of wanting to do clinical notes?
It's geared towards clinical documentation. Yeah. So I'm not getting into like, social media posts or anything like that. I might, it seems like I should probably add that on too for marketing your practice, but yeah, it's not a checklist per se. I love that idea, Tamara. I might just take it from you. No. But it does walk you through modules. So it does talk about all the ethical implications to think through, like check regularly with your licensing board. Are they going to start like issuing statements about how you can use AI in your practice and what the requirements are going to be about that? The professional judgment piece. I also have a whole module on like what is PHI and what is not PHI and how do you differentiate between that? Like it's a whole list of that to walk you through like all of those steps before they even get into how do I use this thing. I've got all of that first, and I've got a big disclaimer. I'm like, please read this. And then also, please read this before you proceed. And then also that other part about, if anything it spits out is not accurate, you have to use your professional judgment like we're talking about and go through all of this in your own EHR, in your own HIPAA compliant place where you're changing information. So that's how I've handled it in the course so far. And it's evolving, I'm calling it like a beta launch with this course because I'm new to it too. I'm still learning and trying to figure out the best way to navigate this stuff.
Yeah. So I think the recommendation that I imagine for someone who is just hearing about AI and they're thinking, how can I use this? It would be a matter of looking at the options and saying, maybe I just want to dabble in it, have it just write some templates for me. Just let me learn what it can do and change it up and see the different outputs that I can get. Or maybe I want to use it in my marketing, but not to first thing to just jump right in there and start having it write notes for you without understanding at all what multiple people have mentioned, how it's going to fill in the blanks about things that may be fiction. And we know that there people have put in ChatGPT something about, tell me about the relationship of these two people. And they've made up a whole scenario about this big, fight that they'd had that was completely fiction. So we need to make sure that people understand that this is operating in fantasy and we are trying to use it in the real world.
Can I ask a question about, because Kim, you were talking about the disclaimers, and it's just in marketing, that's so clear to me that in the bottom of my email, I would say, AI helped me to write this, or I used ChatGPT to write this. Or I think it's kind of cute to say, this headshot is 60% me and 40% I don't know who. Mashed up with me. And I think that's okay in kind of emails, in posts, in whatever, to say that. But how do you do that in clinical practice? So when you talk about disclaimers, if you are going to be using it as part of clinical practice, do we need to put that in our informed consent? Do we need to put that on our website somewhere? Or
I was just going to
to do that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I actually put an informed consent in there, and, it's a template, of course, but, with ideas of how you could include this in your informed consent to say, I may use AI to assist me in your treatment planning and your clinical care, and, discuss it with your client. I talk about that in the course too, like sit down with your client and talk about this, see if they're okay with it, and explain what this means. And totally. Yeah.
Awesome. I got ChatGPT to write all my disclaimers for all those different places as well.
And that's the other thing. I got it to write the informed consent for me, right? The templates. I'm like, give me like 4 informed consent templates to share with the therapists that are going to be taking this course. It's just amazing. It's what you can do with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then of course I take that information and I apply it to what I know about the clinical world and put it in the course, so it is a combination of my mind and the robot's mind, like coming up with this together,
Yeah. So Lyeth, from the overview that you have, which is different, you work in the mental health field, but you're not a clinician.
Correct.
You're a tech guru. So give us some thoughts about what we've been discussing so far.
The main thing, because I think we've kind of honed in on the primary use application that I think has most people's interest peaked, is assisting with progress notes, because that's this huge burden and something that is creating friction for a lot of folks, right? So in terms of that, the main consideration is always who is handling your information? How is it being handled? What happens with it? And when we're considering what is the threshold for what actually constitutes PHI, protected health information, need to be very precise and thorough in that understanding, because otherwise, if you don't have an accurate conceptual framework of what constitutes PHI, it is very easy to suddenly have put a bunch of protected health information into another system where you don't have the necessary legal and ethical assurances in place that they are going to handle that information according to the applicable standards and requirements. So I think because there are different platform options, right, and different ways that people can utilize it. So I'm wanting to draw people back to what kind of a foundational responsibility is that's going to help each of you make more informed choices as you are evaluating how to use something, if it's usable, and figuring out what your responsibilities in correct utilization are. So I love, Kim, that was a core component of the course that you did. That's wonderful to see. And then I do think my perspective would be that utilizing tools that are specifically designed to provide those assurances would be, the PCT recommendation as what's going to be most protective for people. And, we've been through this sort of new technology emerges. It's not yet far enough along necessarily when it first launches to be designed to specifically be meeting the needs of mental health and healthcare professionals. And so things have to catch up. But in that interim period, I've seen a lot of kind of mental gymnastics occur in which folks will try to, well, this isn't PHI or this makes it okay, and kind of bargaining in that way of like, oh, I can use this service that doesn't provide a business associate agreement or something like that. And we've went through that with email, then phone service and texting programs, et cetera. So I'm hoping that maybe some of the lessons learned from going through those processes will then apply to this, of just, it makes your life easier to use the right tool that completely covers your legal and ethical needs. Of course, there's still going to be correct usage responsibilities, but it makes more sense to do that than because it's not a tool that specifically does meet those needs, that you're trying to kind of contort how you utilize it in order to make it feasible.
Yeah, that makes me think of, I was just working on something yesterday related to therapists and their finances and money and how it's so closely connected to our burnout. and how we can be very tempted to DIY a lot of stuff to save money, right? So that we're not paying someone or something to do it for us, but that ultimately, one, is it actually saving you money in the long term? But when it comes to things like this, we have to be so careful to protect our clients and protect ourselves that even if you don't have any ramifications right now, who knows what's going to happen 5 years from now when there really are different changes in legislation and things like that. Like, we have to have a long-term vision of this, and it's worth investing in high quality products and services and training that's going to really make sure it is protecting us and giving us that coverage and CYA that we deserve and our clients deserve over the long term, because AI is not going anywhere. It's been here for a long time. Now it's just so different because we're all talking about Chat GPT. But I think that investment in self and business and the people that we care for is worth way more than saving a diamond nickeling it to DIY.
Absolutely. And I love that point about the self-care or the CYA. And one thing that we say all the time is that CYA is self-care. And in this whole context, you have to think of what's your cost benefit analysis and how much cognitive overhead is it taking? Like, we want to be evaluating what is adding to you. What is it detracting? Does that balance out? And that's something I think that will probably vary provider to provider as well.
I think something that occurs to me when I was listening to you is it's a whole new skill. Yes, it might be a time saver. It might even be a money saver, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also like a whole new skill to learn how to do things, and especially to learn to do them ethically. And outside of the US, where we don't have, different countries have different licensing and privacy laws and things like that. But in some places like the UK, for example, where psychotherapy and counseling isn't regulated, and it is like totally based on personal responsibility, that's also an added load. It's also like hard work to learn a new skill and also have to think about like, okay, and should I be doing this? And like, is this difficult? How do I learn the skill, but also feel like it's okay and kind of, manage all of the nuances of it and all those different aspects. So like, I know I sound like a real critic and I'm very excited about AI, but I just, as everyone's speaking, I'm thinking like, okay, well, yeah, the cost benefit analysis also has to include like how much time it takes to learn this skill as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Tamara, one of the reasons I wanted you here today is because you are a very critical thinker. You always bring those, as is Blythe, obviously, and not that the other ones aren't, but that's a really strong skill. You always think of those little angles that I don't necessarily think of. So those were some really good points there. And I think it's with so many things that we can do with our private practices, there are things that we can do for free all the way to really expensive paid options. And it's a matter of deciding, how am I going to use whatever this thing is that I want to pay for, and learning how to use it, learning that new skill set that we've been talking about. And is it worth the investment in the money if I'm going to be laying awake at night thinking, did I really proofread that progress note it generated for me good enough before I signed it and put it hit enter in my note? Most therapists that I know have set the bar really high. We want to do things appropriately, ethically, humanely, compassionately, all those things. And so I can imagine myself literally not being able to sleep one night because maybe I was rushing. And so maybe I don't click sign right when it generates it. Maybe I have a policy that I need to wait an hour. Like when I'm angry and I type a text to somebody and I don't hit send because I know an hour from now I'm going to be like, okay, I'm a little more calm. That's a harsh text. I'm not going to send that. So that sort of checks and balances process.
Well, I think there's this standard already of professional competencies. If you go into a new modality or you're using a different medium, like with telehealth, you need to be proficient and have professional competency in what you are utilizing, whether that's modality or a mode of communication. And this fits into that as well, right? You need to be informed and equipped with the knowledge to be able to make informed decisions that are going to have the best possible outcomes in terms of client care as well. Kim, the fact that you have created a training to help people get that knowledge and start identifying what questions they need to be asking, what needs to be evaluated as they're stepping into this new territory, I think is the direction that everyone needs to be going in terms of, as we step into this training, going to experts, consulting with peers, really thinking it through and making informed decisions and ensuring that it's fitting with, even if the standard or the ethics codes aren't there with us yet fully across the board about AI use, that there are other components of the ethics codes that should be informing how everyone's thinking about this and approaching it.
Yeah, and this kind of falls along the lines of the many, many, many gray areas we have in our work and the decision-making process and the consultation with other therapists and all the due diligence things that we do to make sure that we're making the right decision. And this is kind of a shiny object syndrome type thing that's real exciting, and especially when platforms are using phrases like magic notes, and it's being discussed and people are putting copies of templates and treatment plans and stuff like that in Facebook groups, and everyone's like losing their mind at how amazing that is. We do need to take that step back and think, okay, before I jump in, what is my decision-making process? Like I said, what are the other tools that I have in making these types of decisions? Because if you're using it for progress notes and templates and our treatment plans and stuff, you are making a clinical decision, and people need to be really clear about that, because that is impacting the clinical care that you're providing to that client, as well as the protection of your license. You need to be looking at that as well, not doing something that's a shortcut today that you're going to end up losing your license over, and then all the hard work you've put into getting where you are is gone.
Absolutely. And I want to just, because this is a nugget of truth and guidance that we go back to a lot, which is something that Eric Strom, who's an attorney and a clinician that we collaborate a lot with, says so frequently, which is, it is okay to be wrong. It is not okay to be unreasonable. That if when you have an ethical conundrum, you need to make the best decision that you can based on everything available to you and due diligence. So you need to be reasonable, even if the end result you turn out to be wrong when more facts are known, right? If you were reasonable and can justify how you came to that decision, that's really what we're aiming for. If we don't have absolutely clearly defined parameters around everything, we're having to make those choices in gray areas. We want to be reasonable.
That's so good. That's like the most amazing point to be closing us out with, Maya. You just summed it all up.
Well, thanks. It's really courtesy of Eric, but I'll use it freely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's high risk work that we do. I think probably none of us realize that once we go into the field and we just want to help people. But the more you're in the field, the more you realize the risks that are involved on lots of different layers, lots of different perspectives. That's why I wanted to have this conversation today, to raise some of these points, to encourage therapists out there to be critical thinkers and to think about their ethics and think about their values and think about the therapeutic relationship. And I'm not sure I would be comfortable seeing a doctor if I knew that AI was listening in to every word I said. I know for sure I would leave things out. And the implications of that are huge in our field, because people need to be able to tell us anything and everything. So those are all considerations that we need to have. And even if you're using something like ChatGPT and you're not specifically putting in information, trying to be vague, but putting information about a specific case, making sure that that's in your informed consent in some way, that the use of AI is something I periodically use in my practice. That way they at least know that that component is there. And I think that's a real important consideration to have.
And I really love what Live said about, if you're finding that you're contorting things to try to make it fit,
right,
go get one of these programs that Life is talking about that has the BAA and is HIPAA compliant, and just spend the money on that. If you're
I agree.
in that ethical gray area, or if it feels weird, it probably is. So.
And take some time to really go through your own practices, standard operating procedures, your SOPs, so that you have that documentation of how you are managing it, knowing that it's a dynamic document when it comes to something like AI. And so you can make copies and show how you're changing and evolving. But that's another important thing that's behind the scenes. Like, we have to make sure it's in our consent, that we talk to our clients about it. We don't just send them the consent and assume that they read it. And then make sure that we have our own paperwork. I have like this huge binder over here that I use as all of my stuff that is going to be outlining how I'm using it right now, and then keep iterations of that as it's changing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's such a great point, Jenny. Like, I will actually joke with my clients at the first session that I doubt you really read the full 7 pages of my informed consent. So let's go through point by point and let me just, highlight them to make sure that we're on the same page here, because we can say they signed it, but it's really our responsibility to make sure they really understand the implications of that.
Absolutely. And that has major implications for the ability to maintain an effective therapeutic alliance as well, because if that is not disclosed, or if it's in the informed consent but was not discussed and they didn't actually see it and then find out later, that can understandably feel like a huge betrayal of trust that can completely rupture a therapeutic alliance.
I was just going to say, just like part of our social media policies as well. And I was thinking that when people listen to this, and there's so many other kind of ways that we can use it as well, like writing SOPs and creating some kind of template, even getting more information about SOAP notes, finding like ways of writing phrases or making things easier for us. And I know I've been like a little bit critical, but I just want to mention that for people who find it really difficult to start from a blank page, that if you're going to use it, like, make it work for you, make it work for you in a way that feels really comfortable and feels ethical, but also makes your life easier. We don't just need to use a tool because other people are using it.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. Does anyone have any final thoughts they'd like to share?
I think it's a really exciting frontier that there are amazing benefits that it has the potential to bring to practitioners, but also to having better treatment outcomes and client care. Those potentials, though, can only really be realized if it's approached from a very diligent, ethical, responsible way. And so the fact that this conversation is happening, that people like all of you are thinking about it and talking with your colleagues about it, creating resources around it, is hopeful, because that means that there's at least a component of the movement around utilization that is looking at the right things, so that potential can be harnessed and the negative potentials aren't realized to the full extent possible, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And additionally, this is, to the general public, this is a new technology, and people having wider access to it. And so we also need to stay on top of what's happening with our professional bodies and our licensing boards and all the different resources we have at our disposal that are giving us guidance, because they are doing the research and looking into the potential harms and hopefully identifying things that maybe we haven't noticed yet or haven't occurred to us. So if we're going to be using this, we need to continue with that education, just like any other continuing education that we do in our field. This, if you're going to use it, needs to be added to your list of, I need to make sure this is something I'm staying on top of. So maybe 5 years down the road, I might say, well, I started out using it responsibly, but I didn't really stay on top and understand that these 5 things have now come out that I didn't know about, and now I'm not using it responsibly any longer. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to join me today. And, I'm on this thing about trying to show how people can come together and have respectful conversations, because we see so little of that in our society. So I so appreciate that we can once again demonstrate that. I don't think we had any blazing disagreements anywhere, but just even talking through the issues and the topics and understanding that we're limited, but we're sharing what we've learned so far. We're sharing our thoughts and perspectives. And now the listeners, it's on them to take that next step and figure out if they're going to use this, how they're going to use it, and all the other tips and thoughts that we shared today. The information for each of our panelists will be in the show notes, so you'll be able to access them and the programs that they offer. For everyone listening, there are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember, our work is hard. It doesn't have to be lonely. Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.